Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Ukrainian show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and today we have our panelists. Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you, Sasha.
As always, my pleasure. And our own Ivan Kucherenko from Kyiv, Ukraine. Welcome, Ivan, to the show.
Hello, Sasha. Hi, Jonathan. Hi, everyone.
Good. And we'll have founder of Network, Nick Poliveda. Welcome to the show, Nick.
Hey, Sasha.
Hi. Ivan, I would like you to start with the video that you have available for today.
Yeah, let's start with it.
Excellent. What a horror.
Yeah, and Holy Hills is like over there near where Larry Elder comes from. I think that's like the middle class area, upper middle class.
Yeah, it's Kryvyi Rih. It's
that's
industrial
definitely upper middle class.
city,
Yeah.
and actually it's a hometown of President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky. He's from Kryvyi Rih, and because this city is not far from the occupied that territory, Russians have a possibility to strike with their ballistic
What about Larry Elder? I'm like,
And-
Larry Elder's a whole 30-minute show, if not an hour.
Sorry, Mark.
Well, you got me in. Hold on a
what did you
second. Steve was over here putting me in the show, or Nick was. Hold on a second, and everything. But I was just actually, how were things going there? I've been the first time I've actually had the pleasure of talking to you and everything along those lines and all in that space. So I know that things are being very much of a struggle there and all in that kind of way. So I hope that you are doing well, and I know that a lot of things are going there in Kiev. So definitely, I'm glad that you're giving us these great reports because, as I've told Sasha, I'm a big fan of the reports that you give on a regular basis. And I thought that was another amazing video.
Okay, let us proceed with the show. Now, Jonathan, I don't want to surprise you.
Well, too late. You just did.
And then say that you will have to answer that. I will go straight to you, so you will understand how to formulate your answer. You know what? I'm following the events in Ukraine very closely, and I'm reading all kinds of literature and messages in English, in Russian, in Ukrainian, all over the places. And this is incredibly, in my opinion, important question. The lack of modern weapons that West, United States, can supply to Ukraine is not happening because of the existing number of weapons in the West is getting depleted, and therefore West is reluctant or maybe even unable to continue supply or starting to supply new system weapons because they will be unable to defend themselves if that scenario will ever happen. On the other hand, in great effect, all the production of existing and new weapons is just being revved up in the West and the United States including, and therefore there will be more and more weapons will be able to be supplied to the Ukraine. So another thing is that for political reasons, West is not supplying the required weapon systems. So, Jonathan, how to make an educated picture, so to speak, of what is really happening with the supply of weapons to Ukraine? Where is the truth?
Okay, nice grenade. the interesting thing here is you have to keep in mind that the West did not fully anticipate the current scenario of the Ukrainians being able to not only successfully resist, but also to, in large measure, take back some of the land from the Russians, which the Russians had occupied. And that, in order for them to do that, there was not a set procedure in place that foresaw a scenario where Ukraine would need a steady supply of modern weapons in order to be able to drive the Russians back out. I do not believe that scenario was adequately foreseen by the Western powers. They did not anticipate this situation. I do not believe that at all. And in effect, the West has been surprised by its own relative success vis-a-vis the Russian army, because much of the conventional wisdom prior to this was that the Russian army was this great superior force that was going to walk over any force opposing it and was capped off by its superiority, marginal superiority, I might add, in nuclear weapons. The problem is that Putin overestimated and underestimated the situation in several respects and has put himself in a situation where the Ukrainians are able to successfully resist. And I would argue the Ukrainians are within striking distance of severing the Crimea from its land route to Russia, which would result in the isolation of the Crimea, and it would result in a major operational victory for Ukraine. None of this has been adequately anticipated by the West. And so they are caught short with having supplied enough weapons for Ukraine to successfully resist and even to mount a counteroffensive. But now they are in danger of being caught short in not having any supplies, really, any supply of modern weapons for use for themselves. I would counter-argue that the West cannot afford to simply cut off supplies from Ukraine or of new weapons. They must continue. Now that they have committed themselves thus far, they must complete the operational victory for Ukraine by giving them what they need in order to complete the operational defeat of Russian forces. If they don't do this, then the odds of a stalemate in that war greatly increase and might well result in giving Russia, by default, what it could not achieve on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think, David, you didn't really comment on the picture of reviving of Western military industry, the industrial.
Well, there certainly is the demand. It certainly is the demand, but they did not plan on mobilizing their resources on a mobilization in order to produce those new weapons. There's the demand now because of the depletion of their existing stocks, but I don't think it has been adequately thought through about the implications of fully mobilizing their industry to replace those weapons. And so those are very expensive high-tech weapons. They are not all that easy to replace.
Absolutely. So, Jonathan, would you agree that by now the war in Ukraine has exposed that West has not been ready for Russian aggression whatsoever. Doesn't matter from Ukraine or from Poland or for Poland or against NATO. NATO and US, they were not prepared. Remember that all US, there is another tragedy is that really, with all this coaching and training, neither US or NATO can really help Ukraine to fight this war, because all their experience in fighting wars where US or NATO had extreme superiority over much weaker opponents, including the air superiority, artillery, just tanks, anything. The war where the fight is on parity basis, like now between Ukraine and Russia, West has no experience of fighting, period. They don't know how to fight this kind of war. They will have to now start learning from this war for themselves how to conduct modern war where there is a parity. They don't know how to do it. They fail even to anticipate that such war is a possibility. So now West has to learn really something about fighting a modern war with a equal opponent, equally determined, equally skillful, and with a lot of weaponry available, and unfortunately very quick to learn from Ukrainians, not from US, not from NATO, from Ukrainians. Russians are learning and learning fast. Ivan, what can you say about you Russians learning from Ukrainians how to fight?
Unfortunately, it is, and we've seen that the initial tactics of Russians when they tried to attack with those very massive amount of battle armor vehicles, they've stopped doing it when they've received such high casualties. We've seen several tries when they've tried to attack the same tactics near Vuhledar, and they failed as well. And unfortunately, we gave Russia enough time to prepare for Ukrainian offense. They were expecting it to start in May, in the end of the spring, actually. And if Ukraine had all the weapons which were promised to Ukraine to get in time, then probably this counteroffense could start earlier. But the active part of counteroffense started only in June. And Russians had enough time to mine the territory. They actually utilized enormous amount of mines because Russia had a great amount of ammunition from the Soviet times and great amount of weapons from the Soviet times, and they're now utilizing it in Ukraine. They've modified the anti-air missiles S-300 in order to use them as ballistic ground missiles. They're not precise, but they're using them to bombard Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure. They can't use them to make precise strikes on Ukrainian army, but it's enough for them to use them as a weapon of terror. And with the same goal, they're using mines. They've got huge amounts of mines left from the Soviet Union, and they've used all their available resources to mine all the battlegrounds between the Ukrainian army positions and the Russian positions, and actually it slowed. So they're unfortunately they're studying. Russians also noticed that Ukraine was using drones very efficiently in this war, and they started to use them as well. And we've seen the statistics when the import of drones from China to Russia, just regular civilian drones like Mavic, DJIs, and other, it increased enormously, while import of drones to Ukraine from China decreased, and China is starting to block the import of drones. They are assisting Russia in this war, definitely, and Russians started to use the drones more efficiently because it helped Ukraine to achieve greater results on the battlefield and make better reconnaissance and artillery strikes using the drones. And they're studying. They're not so dumb as we sometimes see in movies about Russians. At least their commanders are smart enough, and unfortunately, they have enough money to purchase the electronics on the West using some smuggling to purchase it, to purchase some semiconductor electronics, and even from American companies, and use them in rockets which they produce to strike Ukrainian cities. And it's actually it's a great challenge for Ukraine and for United States and for our partners from the West to show something against their tactics. And,
Actually, Ivan, speaking about tactics, you just with the drones, what you mentioned, there were several attacks on Moscow by drones. Interestingly enough, all Western advisors, including US, they forbid Ukraine to attack Russian territory with the Western weapons. So as long as Ukraine is producing their own drones, they can attack with drones as much as possible, except one thing. Why US and NATO forbid Ukrainians to attack Russian territory? Because they are scared of escalation of war. But if Ukrainian is doing the same thing with Ukrainian produced weapons, including drones, then it is escalation anyway, because if you attack and you damage the enemy's territory and killing some people here and there, it is escalation, because the Russia is not going to figure out, oh, were we attacked by Ukrainian weapons or Ukrainian-made weapons or Ukrainian-acquired weapons, and this weapon was acquired from the United States, so they're our enemy now. Oh, and this one was acquired, let's see, from Africa. Okay, so we can ignore the Africa. So, Nick, question to you. So the West, United States, are scared of escalation. But farther and farther ahead, as more drones and other equipment Ukrainians, missiles including, will be able to produce, and are already producing, by the way, then what's the West position? This escalation will go anyway, and subsequently, West is so fearful about this escalation, which will happen anyway. So what West should do?
Well, Sasha, it's not just escalation. The whole strategy of bombing Moscow could backfire for this reason. Psychologically, we don't know that the people in Russia may feel anger, and right now they may be ambivalent, don't know what their country's doing in Ukraine to begin with. When you start bombing Moscow, you may start uniting the Russians against the West as opposed to keeping them separate, saying, what are we doing here? So it has another psychological, perhaps negative effect to send drones to Moscow, as much as I understand why you would want to do that. And some rogue Ukrainians will do it anyway because you can't stop them. But at the same time, I think the official position for Zelensky's purpose said, we don't want to bomb Moscow. We're here to take our territory. And that's it. and if they can hold that position, then the people in Russia may disintegrate. In other words, then they all of a sudden said, well, don't they have a point that what are we doing in Ukraine to begin with? Which, by the way, is a good question. I don't see any objectives that Putin's going to make except the mistake that was made in 2018, where he easily marched into Crimea and took the Crimea, and the West didn't do anything.
In 2014, right?
In 2014, but that's then, and this is now. And now the blunder on the chessboard, as you know, he marched into Ukraine and came in from the north toward Kyiv, didn't get Kyiv, and he left. Now that was very interesting. That showed a retreat on the Russians' part, which I think this is now a battle of wills. If Ukraine is persistent, they're going to get back all their territory. Period. The end.
Well, we all know that in order to take the territory, you have to kill as many Russian soldiers as possible. That will bring back your territory because there will be not enough Russian soldiers still alive to protect this territory. So we are coming to a situation. Of course, many people who are listening to my comments dislike them a lot, because essentially what I'm propagating is keep killing Russian soldiers as much as possible. But Russian soldiers, in a way, are innocent people from one point of view who fell in trap of Russian propaganda and Putin's evil desires. On, but the Russian soldiers are ones who commit killings, Ukrainians who are reflect severe damage to Ukrainian infrastructure, to Ukrainian cities, and just a few days ago, my hometown of Odessa, just 2 blocks where I was living while I was in Odessa, that beautiful structure was severely damaged. So how to, now another question, Jonathan, excuse me, I'd like really...
Time for me to wake up. Another grenade is coming.
Yeah, no, okay, I'll do it easy. I'll do it very easy.
Right.
So I remember yesterday's show on Pod TV. Yeah, we have Honorable David Pocher and several other distinguished personalities, including yourself and even myself, and Nick Poliveda, who was conducting the panel. So there were 3 scenarios discussed. One is a possibility that Russia wins the war. Another possibility is that Ukraine wins the war. And third possibility is a stalemate. Nobody wins. It's like in chess, it's a draw, and both sides were exhausting their arsenal. They lost all their bishops, rooks, queens, and everything else. And there is a draw because there's no material left. So let me ask you, Jonathan, what you can see a scenario. Let's see a first scenario. I'll give you an example. Russia wins. How you envision what has to happen for Russia to win, how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and then the other 2 scenarios.
Well, first, a scenario in which Russia wins what would have to happen is that the aid that the West has been giving to Ukraine up to this point would have to stop. How would it stop? It would stop if, for example, if in next year's elections we get in an administration that is against supplying the Ukrainians with what they need, and they cut off supplies to Ukraine.
I know even the name of this administration.
Say, I figure everyone knows who that would be, so I don't see no need to mention it.
Okay.
In any case, if that scenario occurred where Western aid to Ukraine is greatly reduced to where Ukraine is no longer able to sustain operations, offensive or defensive, well, they could sustain defensive operations for a while, but any chance of Ukraine recovering its territory from Russia at that point, with the absence of Western aid, would be problematic, and eventually the Russians would grind them down. Now, mind you, in the historical precedent, in the Second World War, when the Soviet troops came back through, the Russians came back through and reoccupied Ukraine, the Ukrainians were fighting a guerrilla war against both the Nazis and the Russians, a guerrilla movement which was not fully suppressed until about 1954. And that is not well known in the West. The Ukrainians would, in the event of this, there would be technically a Russian suppression or occupation of Ukraine, and it would be a victory, quote unquote, but it would be a Pyrrhic victory, a very costly victory for Russia. That is a scenario in which Russia wins, but at very heavy cost. So that is one scenario, but in order for that to happen, Western aid and resupply to Ukraine would have to stop, and that would be for political reasons, not for military ones.
And very important, Jonathan, if I may add that with the new administration coming as a result of the election, never mind that it's only in November next year, so there is almost a year and a half before new administration will take office. And that still doesn't make, number one, that the all U.S. Help will stop. Still doesn't mean, but a lot of chances. But even though, then the other Western countries, especially if what they're now working is Ukraine will have several treaties, two-way treaties with G7 countries. So then even in the absence of U.S. help, Ukraine still can continue to fight for a long and very long time, right?
That's true, at least defensively.
For sure. Yeah.
And Sasha, just really quickly, and this is like maybe even for Jonathan, if he knows, are we seeing any Russian soldiers that are defecting in mass numbers or anything along those lines? Because we do know that sometimes if a war is unpopular, coming back to Nick's point, that people will see that the war is not being fought for a good purpose from the standpoint of the country fighting it. We saw that in Vietnam. If I can go back in time, there were a number of soldiers that were of various minority communities that just saw what was going on and were not the biggest fans of that war, and some of them even went to Canada and if they were being drafted and other kinds of things, and they definitely deserted from the situation. And even those that went into the service were oftentimes frustrated by what they saw in Vietnam and all in that way. So are we seeing any of that from the Russian side in this particular war that has been going almost 3 years now and all in that space? Are we seeing any sign of folks leaving and leaving in mass?
Ivan, I haven't heard about mass defection of Russians. Have you heard anything of that magnitude?
Not because this attack is not the same as the previous Ukrainians counterattacks were, and we've seen the mass defeat of Russians when they attacked Kiev, and they had to flee from the Kiev and from the northern part of Ukraine. There was a brilliant operation in Kharkov region when they were surprised, were gotten surprised and just had to flee. They in some directions they were fleeing even towards the border of Russia with Ukraine. And in Kherson region, there was another kind of operation when Ukraine, for several months, actually cut the Russian logistics, and then Russians had to leave the occupied territory because it was unable for them to supply their army on that territory. And in this operation, when they have the several lines of defense which Ukraine has to advance through without support of aviation, without great support from helicopters, from fighter jets, because Russia is more stronger than Ukraine in the air, unfortunately. And even in these conditions, Ukrainian troops are advancing through those first lines of defense. and in some places, as far as I know, Ukrainian troops are already coming to the last line of defense of Russians, and as soon as that line of defense will be breached, then hopefully we will receive great news of defeat of Russia in some territories. But now this advance, unfortunately, is pretty slow. Why it is pretty slow? We've already discussed. We are lacking the heavy vehicles, heavy armor. We are lacking the artillery. We are lacking, and we have no fighter jets. F-16s, unfortunately, will come too late for this counterattack. Probably they will be used in another one. But anyway, even in these conditions, Ukrainian army is advancing. And what is remarkable, that Ukrainian army is advancing faster than Russian army was advancing on the east, when they couldn't take Bakhmut for almost a year, having the better forces, more powerful forces, both on the ground and on the air, and greater artillery power. They were advancing slowly. Then Ukraine is advancing now without any superiority in the air, and without long-range missiles, actually.
And a very important, Ivan, that Ukrainians didn't have fortifications and minefields that the Russian built in the last several months.
They had fortifications because that line was prepared, but not
mining fields.
Not so high amount of mining field, because obviously Ukraine has fewer resources on mines. And what we didn't actually discuss before, but how Russia was preparing for this war, and they've destroyed several military warehouses before the invasion. And these warehouses were destroyed with ammo, were destroyed not even in Ukraine, but they were also destroyed in Bulgaria. There were some accidents, like some fires on the military warehouse in Bulgaria and in, I guess, Slovakia or Czech Republic. So when they were preparing, they've destroyed those warehouses, which had a great amount of old Soviet ammunition, which could be used by Ukraine in this war, including mines, of course. And that time, no one was destroying the warehouses in Russia. They had all those Soviet potential of enormous ammo, enormous mines, some old and not so old tanks, artillery, and both with some modern pieces of weapons which they produced. So actually it is a tough battle, and Ukraine need support of Western countries and United States to win it. And of course we need at least to have some game changer in this battle. Like last year when we received the HIMARS systems, it changed the rules on the battlefield a lot. If we received the fighter jets, F-16s, then probably this could change the party, and Ukraine could be advanced more quickly and faster liberate our territories. Or at least while we are not receiving the F-16s, then probably we can get ATACMS missiles.
Exactly.
And this also can be a game changer. But we need a game changer, because in this situation, all those estimates, they are completely broken on the defense of Russia. And the reason is quite simple. They had enough time to prepare for this defense. When Ukraine started to prepare for the counterattack the last winter, and when we were promised to receive the tanks, the modern tanks, we haven't received all the amount of tanks yet. We don't have Abrams tanks. for now, for instance, we can't use them in our counteroffense. They were promised, but we haven't received them yet, and that's regarding the other heavy weapons. And unfortunately, all of us gave time for Russia to prepare, using all their possibilities and a lot of minds.
I would venture, and Jonathan, you please correct me if I'm wrong, I would venture that at this point, ATACMS missiles are much more needed and would be much more effective than F-16s, simply because there is a lot of questions with F-16s, and unless they're fully electronically integrated with all other forces, they may not be so effective, especially if Russia will revive all their old planes like MiG-21, MiG-23, never mind MiG-29 and more modern planes. And there will be air battles, which does not guarantee that without all the necessary electronic support, F-16s will be that much effective. Although ATACMS systems, they can be used right away from the same HIMARS systems. And what's important is that if their range is, say, 300 kilometers, so right now their range is 70, 80 kilometers. So Russians had to move all their supply lines to around 120 kilometers from the front lines, which is a lot, but still manageable. Now, in case of 300 range of ATACMS, they will have to move their supply lines 350 kilometers away from front lines, maybe 400 kilometers. What kind of supply lines is 350 to 400
That's a very fragile supply line, a very tenuous one. And right now, even without the additional weapons that Ukraine is requesting, they are very close to achieving a severance of the supply line between the land supply line between between the Crimea and Russia. And once that event occurs, then Russia is faced with a significant operational defeat on the Ukrainian front. And the Ukrainian, interestingly enough, the West has failed. The U.S. and NATO nations failed to anticipate the success of the Ukrainian army in defending itself and in its ability to conduct a counteroffensive. They were not. No one in the West was anticipating the degree of Ukrainian success that has been achieved thus far. We have been ironically surprised by our own success, and so we did not plan for this adequately. For this contingency, we did not have plans in place for mobilization of our industrial capacity to sustain an effort to immediately. We did not immediately begin resupply and reconstruction of the necessary modern weapon systems to bring our inventories back up. We simply gave them the ones that we had and hoped that would be enough.
Hey, Jonathan, just really quickly, because I know that historically there have been war games, and it's kind of what Sasha was asking you about earlier and everything, that there is this theoretical notion of a war, and the Ukrainian war is far from anything that is theoretical. It's a very active war with a lot of bodies that are mounting up and everything. So were we not prepared, and were our generals not able to have these theoretical ideas of what was going on? Because I think that that's really where Sasha was going on earlier, was we were not prepared enough and everything to be actively engaged in a war of any sort, and it actually kind of, in a lot of ways, exposed us to our enemies and everything.
What it exposed is it exposed this war exposed the Western failure to adequately anticipate this scenario. Right. We did not anticipate the degree of success on the part of the Ukrainian armed forces. And there have been war games in the past, and I will mention the January 1997 Army After Next Winter War Game, in which we postulated a potential war. We were really testing out our advanced weapon systems and our concepts to see what would happen in about 2020 in a confrontation with red, i.e., Russia, and blue forces, i.e., the U.S. supplying NATO in countering a Russian intervention in Belarus and Poland. And we thought we were anticipating that situation. The red team, however, launched a preemptive strike in space to hit blue's satellites, and that was not anticipated by the blue team, and they were caught with an operational surprise. And as a result, the lessons learned from that war game were that we should be very aware of the potential vulnerability of our blue satellite, of Western satellite systems. I would argue that right now our U.S. Space Force, we call it a Space Force, but according to all open sources, the Space Force consists of 80 satellites. That is not a Space Force. That is to the Russians and the Chinese, that is a set of 80 targets which need to be struck or disrupted. And in order to have a Space Force, which means anything in terms of operational capability, or, as I argue, a global ballistic missile defense system, you have to have a space fleet. I would argue that we have not been adequately thought through that possibility. And that is something that will have to be thought through and addressed once we achieve at least an armistice in this current conflict. Because a genuine peace treaty right now between the two antagonists is not possible. They have politically irreconcilable objectives. And
Jonathan, may
yes.
I ask you, how the armistice is possible at this current situation?
The armistice can only be possible is if even so, the Russia must be deprived of its principal operational objectives, and what must happen is that the Crimea must be operationally severed. Supply lines must be severed from the land bridge. Crimea must be cut off so that the forces in Crimea are cut off, isolated, and eventually have to surrender. That's one thing. Then the Ukrainian counteroffensive has to be able to drive out the Russians that are currently occupying Ukrainian territory and push them back to pre-war lines, to pre-war borders. So once you have the pre-war status quo in place, operationally speaking, then you have the possibility of an armistice where the Russians say, okay, let's cut our losses. And Putin would have to claim that they had achieved the objectives of their special military operations by merely inflicting damage on Ukrainian territory. But any armistice has to be an armistice that is achieved by operational victory on the battlefield, one that at least restores the pre-war status quo and arguably returns the Crimea to Ukrainian control. That is the only path to an armistice that exists right now. Anything less than that rewards Russia for its unprovoked aggression against Ukraine.
Exactly. So therefore, all the talks about armistice at this point are absolutely fruitless, and it's nothing.
Until operational victory is achieved by the Ukrainian forces on the battlefield, talk of an armistice is useless.
Jonathan, speaking about just one remark about unpreparedness of the West to the present war scenarios, which is happening now, there are two elements. Element number one is they didn't believe that Ukraine will resist for so long and actually will continue on as a country because
they ignored the lessons of World War II. They did not adequately study. They did not adequately learn from history on the success of the Ukrainian resistance in World War II and after the end of World War II.
And exactly.
Jonathan, did they resist the lesson from just society in general? Because every country that I am aware of, whether it is African nations, Asian nations, or a number of other nations, has always put up a fight. Now, some of the fights might not have been successful. I mean, the only one that I can think of that really did not resist that much was, and they're not that big of a nation, was the Falklands. But other than that, most nations that have been invaded are not going to put up with it lightly and everything. So I think
Marshall, with all due respect, this Asian, African, and Latin American and other nations, they were never faced an enemy as strong as Russia. Never,
correct.
ever.
given
So there's no comparison, and so there's not even the vote. You know, I'm sick and tired of on shows on your what is this World Edition, when I talk about Ukrainian situation. People, actually including yourself, mention, oh, there are other conflicts in the world. There is a conflict in Africa and some people are being killed. And there is another conflict in Asia and there are some people oppressing some other people. So
And
on.
none of these other countries face an opponent as brutal as Russia.
Actually, United Nations and maybe other nations should also consider that most of these conflicts are provoked by Russia. Russia, they have their interest in Africa, and they're using the Wagner Group to destabilize the governments of African republics. They're using the grain initiative and blocking of Ukrainian seaports and export of grain from Ukraine to destabilize the situation in Africa as well. And maybe when you're ill, and for instance you have some problems with your health, you have two ways. One way is to treat the consequences, to use some kind of creams or drink some pills, and other way is to find the reason of that ill and cure it all. And maybe for the civilized world at least should understand that the reason of the most conflicts and the most troubles in the world is Russia, which is trying to ruin the security order in the world in order for a small team of Russian bandits and oligarchs to keep their money, which they've stolen from the Russian people, and to keep their power. That's the only reason, and to get even more money while trading with the weapons.
Ivan, I'll tell you the easiest way, and Jonathan, I will help you with your scenario how Ukraine will win, and very quickly. If Belarusia and Wagner groups, who is now located, or remains of Wagner group, whatever they are, that there are a lot of talks that they will cross the Polish border and will attack Poland. That will spell the end of the war in 2 weeks, because first of all, the Poland will, in 3-4 days, they will take over all Belarusia very easily, because Poland is just waiting for opportune moment. They are struggling to stay away from the battle. They are trying very, very hard to contain themselves and just wait and wait and wait. And Wagner Group and the stupid Lukashenko, they will just help them to unleash all their might on Belarus. And now what Russia gonna do? It's gonna say, well, it was Belarus. Sorry, guys, you miscalculated. You made a mistake. Now you have to pay for it. And or what? They're gonna defend Belarus? So they will expose themselves and will be wiped out.
But Sasha, along those same lines, and I was just wondering, because I hear what you're saying and everything, but isn't the Russian army, or at least trying to disrupt a number of places around the nation, to Ivan's point, because I personally think that they were involved in Niger and that coup that was going on there. But I'm also would not be surprised, and I'd love to hear Ivan's thoughts about this, if they are not involved with even some of the disruptions that are going on in France. I know that it's around labor and other things, but I'm sure that they are probably involved in that as well, because that would be another disruption of the West and everything. So Ivan, are they involved in some of this other?
They're involved in everything what you mentioned and much more. They're involved in US politics. They're involved in everywhere from UK to Germany to France again, to everywhere. It doesn't help on the battlefield. That's a problem.
actually, they're using the old Soviet tactics. You know that Soviet Union was involved in an enormous number of conflicts throughout the world. They've supported the Irish Republican Army, which used the methods of terrorism in Ireland to destabilize the United Kingdom, and there are other examples, and definitely they have their nose in all kind of these conflicts, at least with their propaganda, because they manipulate in media and striking the different audiences in order to make a conflict, and probably in some cases they're using weapons, in some cases they're just paying money, in some cases they're using the direct military power, for instance, that Wagner group, and at the same time, so they're saying that one time they're saying that Wagner group has nothing in common with Russia, and the second time they're saying that Wagner group was completely funded by Russian government, and all those millions of dollars they received, they were coming from the budget of Russian Federation. And Putin said that directly. And the answer on the question how to stop it is simple, and it's the same for almost 1.5 years to defeat Russia on the battlefield, on the open battlefield. For now, the one open battlefield with Russia is between Ukraine and Russia. And if Ukraine will completely defeat Russia on the battlefield, I hope, and a lot of other colleagues and analytics consider that this defeat will have the future consequences for Russia, and it will probably destroy their external kind of politics. They will be so busy with what is happening internal in Russia that they will have no time and no resources to harm in other countries in the world. So the answer is quite simple.
Thank you, Ivan.
Yes.
I agree with you. I agree.
And I agree that the absolute prerequisite to achieving an armistice is the operational defeat of Russian forces in Crimea and on Ukrainian territory. There is no other viable path given the politically irreconcilable objectives of Russia and Ukraine.
So, Jonathan, in your scenario, armistice could be replaced by capitulation. Don't you think so?
Yeah, the Russians would have. The Russians would try to leadership would try to put the best face on it as possible with their propaganda, saying that they would claim that they have achieved the objectives of their special operation.
Of course.
Ukraine has been sufficiently punished, and they would therefore go back to quietly revert to an armed truce. But then at that point, it would be in the West's interest to rebuild Ukraine and restore defenses and restore their supplies and lay the groundwork for future integration of Ukraine into NATO.
Absolutely.
Movement down and everything.
Say
I
again?
had a quick question, but go ahead, Ivan.
I don't agree with Jonathan. Of course, Russia will try to say, using their propaganda, that they've achieved all the goals and they've defeated Ukraine, and Ukraine now is demilitarized and denationalized, and all that idiotic stuff they've put as their goals of their so-called special operation. But there is a huge risk that all their thousands of soldiers, which are currently being on the battlefield in Ukraine, and which are really seeing the real picture of this war, according to the interrogations of captured Russian soldiers, according to the capture of their calls to their relatives, when they will come back to Russia, they will spread the real information
They will not
about
be
this war.
Putin's friends.
Yeah, they're not going to be Putin's friends. Hey,
Yeah, at
hey,
at
Ivan and
minimum, they
Sasha,
will
just
not be
really,
friends.
just really quickly, is there any danger that could exist? Because you've alluded to it a couple of times about Alaska and everything, but there are some things that are off on the side of America and the West in general that could be disruptive. I mentioned what was going on in France, but is there any possibility that, say, Putin or some of the folks could instigate conflicts out of Mexico or out of Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico wants to be independent and everything, that he could instigate internal conflicts that could cause disruption to the support of the West to Russia? So is there any danger of that? Because I'm thinking that if you are militarily minded, you could instigate for people that are near the American side to disrupt the support and everything.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Speaking about Puerto Rico and some other points that you just mentioned, all U.S. will need to send a helicopter or two, and it will be the end of it in about 6.5 hours, maybe faster. The real danger actually is New York area, the Brighton Beach, when there are a couple of millions of former Soviet Union people and who are very, very sympathetic to Trump, and they are, although many of them are from Ukraine, and actually only lately, when all the atrocities in Ukraine, these people turned against Putin and Donald Trump and so on. But just before the war started, they were all watching for 10.5 hours a day Russian First Channel. They were for pro-Putin 100%. They were pro-Trump. And now situation is changing. So we'll see how things will develop. So I think that, Jonathan, you completed your answer to your question. You mentioned armistice, which is impossible. You mentioned Russian victory, which is impossible. And you discussed Ukrainian victory, which is not only possible, it's desirable, and most likely will happen in the near future. And I wish Biden would more clearly, he was good explaining why F-16s cannot be supplied because of training, logistics, and so there are like 19 different reasons. But he never, ever mentioned why ATACMS missiles cannot be supplied right now. There is no answer, there is a void. Jonathan, have you heard something different? No. Oh, to avoid escalation. I know.
Yeah.
To avoid escalation.
That would be the standard reply.
Absolutely. Okay, guys, thank you so much for participating in today's program. And I will see you on Friday next, same time, same day, and same place. And hope we'll have great news to discuss. Thank you so much, everybody. Slava Ukraini!